Montana Territory, 1878. Snow still clung to the shoulders of the Absaroka Range, and the wind moved low through the cottonwoods like it carried secrets. Brielle Langford stepped off the wagon with her boots hitting hard-packed dirt, her skirts heavy with dust and wear. Her fingers were red from the cold, her face wind-burnt, and her heart tired. She had not come to Alder Bend for love. She had come because there was nowhere else left to go. She was 23, unmarried, and had spent the last 7 years caring for her father until the fever took him. There was no family left, no home but the one she could scrape together with what he left behind: a few coins, a broken-down wagon, and a letter from a woman in Alder Bend who ran the boarding house and owed her father a favor. Brielle's reflection in the frost-glazed window of the mercantile did not lie. Her cheekbones stood out too sharp. Her hair, once a soft chestnut, had dulled to mud brown, always pulled back tight. She had no softness left to her. No man had ever looked at her twice, not just because she was poor, but because she had never been pretty and she knew it. She stepped inside the store, hoping to ask about work or maybe just warmth. The bell overhead rang, and she stepped into the scent of dried beans, gun oil, and leather. That was when she saw him. He stood at the counter, tall and broad-shouldered, with a weathered duster hanging open over a dark shirt. He had a roughness to him: sun-dark skin, a jawline that had lost a few fights, and a scar just under his right eye. But his eyes were warm, golden hazel, and when they met hers he blinked, then smiled slow and easy, like he was surprised to see her there, like he was glad. "Afternoon," he said. She nodded, unsure what to do with the way her chest kicked. He turned back to the counter, finished paying for a sack of flour, then stepped aside and held the door open for her. "You new in town?" he asked, voice low and calm. She hesitated. "Just got in." He tipped his hat. "Name's Xander Jameson. Folks call me Xander." "Brielle Langford." He paused. "Langford, you any kin to Walter Langford? Fought in the Dakota campaign." "He was my father," she said, stiffening. Xander's face softened. "He saved my uncle's life outside of Fort Rice." "I owe that man more than I can say." Brielle blinked, her throat tightening. "He passed this winter." Xander touched the brim of his hat again, slower this time. "I'm sorry. He was a good man." He walked her to the boarding house without asking. She did not stop him. The streets of Alder Bend were muddy and lined with buildings still half-built. Smoke curled from chimneys, and men in buffalo coats passed by on horseback. The cold bit through her gloves, but beside him, she felt warmer. At the door, she hesitated. "I do not expect anyone here to take much notice of me." Xander looked at her, quiet a moment. "Why would you think that? I know what I look like." She lifted her chin. "I ain't pretty enough for a man." He stared at her like she had just spoken a language he did not understand. Then he stepped in closer, voice low. "That's funny," he said. "I see only you." She flushed, her breath catching. "I mean it," he said. "You walk into a room, and everything else fades out." Brielle opened her mouth, but nothing came. No one had ever spoken to her like that. Not with truth in their voice and kindness in their eyes. He took a step back, respectful. "If you need anything, I work north of town. Jameson Ranch. Just ask for me." She watched him go, his stride steady, the duster swinging behind him like a curtain falling. The next few days were hard. The woman who ran the boarding house, Mrs. Cora, let Brielle stay in exchange for cleaning and laundry. Brielle worked long hours, scrubbing the floors, mending sheets, and hauling buckets of water until her back ached. No one in town paid her much notice. But every afternoon, around the same time, Xander would pass by the boarding house on horseback, and he always looked up. Sometimes he tipped his hat. Once, He handed her a small bundle of dried winterberries and said, "Figured you might like a taste of something sweet." She had not stopped thinking about him since. One morning, a knock came at the back door. She opened it with her apron still damp from washing. Xander stood there, looking sheepish. "I could use a hand." He scratched the back of his neck. "Got a calf stuck in the creek bed. Ma said I should find someone who can keep their head in cold water." Brielle blinked. "You want me to help?" He grinned. "You are the only one I trust to do it right." She followed him out to the ranch. The ride was short, and the sun was high, melting the last of the snow. The creek bed was half frozen, and sure enough, a calf had slipped in, legs splayed, bleeding. Xander went in first, boots crunching over the ice. When he slipped, she extended her hand without thinking. He caught it, their fingers locking tight, and she helped steady him. Together, they got the calf out, him lifting, her guiding. When it was done, they stood in the sunlight, dripping and breathless. "You are strong," he said, looking at her like she had just grown wings. She shook her head, laughing. "You are just surprised a woman can work." "I am surprised you are still single," he said, then flushed. She looked away, heart pounding. "You do not believe me," he said quietly. "No, why not?" She looked up at him, her eyes stinging. "Because no one ever has." He came closer, slowly, like she might bolt. "Brielle," he said, voice rough, "I see you. Not just your hands or your work or your name. I see you." The wind moved around them, soft now, carrying the scent of pine and thawing earth. She did not speak. She just leaned into him, and he caught her, not with urgency or heat, but with a kind of quiet surety that said, "I will not drop you. Not now. Not ever." She rested her head against his chest, and he held her like something precious. Neither of them said another word. They did not need to. The sun hung low when they rode back to town, shadows stretching long across the prairie. Xander's horse picked its way steady along the trail, hooves quiet in the thaw-softened dirt. Brielle rode behind on a borrowed mare, her skirt damp where it had soaked through at the creek. She didn't mind. The cold had long since settled into her bones, but something else had begun to warm her from the inside, slow and uncertain. They didn't speak again until the roofs of Alder Bend came into view between the cottonwoods. "You ever worked with animals before?" he asked without looking over. "No," she said, "but I've stitched worse wounds than that calf had. My father. He got hurt often enough." Xander nodded once. "You didn't flinch. Most folks do first time." She glanced down at her gloved hands, the fabric still stiff with mud. "Flinching doesn't help much when something needs doing." He slowed his horse as they reached the edge of town. "You ever think about staying on at a ranch? Might be steadier than laundry and dishes." She frowned. "You offering me a job?" "Only if you want one. Ma's been saying we need another set of hands. Someone who doesn't mind early mornings and quiet days. Food and room included." Brielle's fingers tightened on the reins. "You sure she'd be fine with someone like me?" Xander finally looked over. "Someone like you? I don't exactly fit," she said. "I don't come from ranch folk. I wasn't raised out here." He tilted his head, thoughtful. "You carry yourself like you were. Most folks born out here don't last half as long when things go sideways." The mare shifted beneath her, and she steadied it without thinking. Xander watched her do it. "My ma would like you. She respects grit more than bloodlines." They reached the boarding house, the porch already in shadow. She dismounted carefully, boots hitting ground with a soft thud. He stayed in the saddle, one hand resting easy on the horn. "I'll think on it," she said. "I'll be here," he told her. Either way. She didn't say goodnight, just nodded and stepped inside, the door closing soft behind her. 2 days passed before she saw him again. She kept busy mending a broken chair leg, boiling lye soap for the linens, helping Mrs. Cora patch a draft in the back room. But his offer sat in her chest like a warm coal, steady and persistent. On the third morning, she found herself walking north, beyond the last of the houses, past the churchyard and the forge. The wind was calmer than usual, carrying a scent of soil and thaw. A few meadowlarks flitted low across the plain. She pulled her shawl tighter and kept walking. The Jameson house stood plain but solid against the hills, whitewashed boards and a stone chimney that puffed slow smoke. A few cattle grazed beyond the barn, and a boy no older than 10 ran after a chicken with a stick. A woman stepped onto the porch, wiping her hands on her apron. Her hair was pulled back in a thick gray braid, her eyes sharp beneath dark brows. "You must be Brielle." She stopped at the bottom of the steps. "Yes, ma'am." The woman studied her a moment. "I'm Miriam. Xander told me about you. Figured you'd come by sooner or later." "I'm not looking for charity." Miriam gave a short nod. "Good. We don't offer it. But we do need someone who knows how to work without being asked twice." "I can do that." "Can you cook?" "Yes." "Churn butter?" "Yes." "Handle a rifle if need be?" Brielle hesitated. "Only once. But I didn't miss." Miriam's mouth twitched, almost like a smile. "You'll do. Come in, then." By evening, Brielle had churned a half-tub of cream, carried water from the pump, and helped mend a torn quilt in silence while Miriam hummed under her breath. She didn't see Xander until supper, when he came in dust-coated and sun-touched, his collar open and his hair damp from the pump out back. He paused when he saw her at the table, ladling stew into bowls like she'd belonged there all along. "You came," he said. "I did." He sat without another word, but when their hands brushed passing the bread, neither pulled away. After the meal, Miriam took her knitting to the front room, and Xander lingered by the stove, watching the flames lick the iron grate. "You ever miss where you were before?" he asked quietly. "I never belonged to it," she said. "Too much silence after my father passed. Too many stairs before that." He looked over. "You don't have to carry that out here. It doesn't come off easy." "I know," he said, "but you're not alone in it." He didn't touch her, but his nearness felt like a hand at her back, steady, unspoken, sure. She met his gaze, the heat from the stove warming one side of her face. "I don't know what this is." "Neither do I," he admitted. "But I know I want to find out." Brielle breathed in deep, tasting wood smoke and stew and something else underneath hope. Maybe. Not loud or sudden, just a quiet knowing that maybe, just maybe, this was a place she could stay, a life she could build. With him. Morning came with the sound of roosters and the scent of damp earth. Brielle stood at the pump behind the Jameson house, sleeves rolled up as she hauled the handle down again and again, water splashing into a dented tin basin. Her arms ached from the past day's work, but the ache felt clean, earned. Inside, Miriam was baking oat bread, and the smell drifted through the open window. A warm breeze moved across the yard, carrying the call of a meadowbird and the low murmur of cattle beyond the barn. Xander came around the side of the house, wiping his hands with a cloth. His shirt was untucked at one side, and there was a line of dirt across his jaw like he'd been fixing something that didn't want fixing. "You ever saddle a mule?" he asked, pausing beside her. "No, but I've gotten a cow to stand still long enough to stitch its leg," she said, wiping her hands dry. He smiled, not wide, just enough to crease the corners of his eyes. "Close enough. Ours has a mind of her own. Thought you might come with me to the south pasture." "What for?" "Fence lines down. I can haul the rails, but I'll need someone steady to hold them while I hammer." Brielle nodded. "I'll get my boots." They walked together through the tall grass, Xander leading the mule with a length of frayed rope. The animal snorted and tossed its head a few times, but didn't give real trouble. The sun was just high enough to warm the backs of their necks, and the trees along the creek rustled with the sound of spring coming on. At the break in the fence, Xander set down the tools and gestured. "You hold here, just like that." Brielle braced the post with both hands while he drove the nails in. The thud of iron meeting would echoed over the hills, steady and sure. She didn't speak, and neither did he. It was the kind of silence that didn't press, just filled the space between them like breath. When the last rail was in place, he stood back and wiped his brow with his sleeve. "That'll hold." She leaned her weight against it, testing. "Feels like it." He sat down in the grass, stretching his legs out. "You can sit too. Fence won't mind." She joined him, adjusting her skirt beneath her. The grass was cool and damp, the scent of fresh earth rising around them. "I was thinking," he said, watching the sky. "You ever want to learn to ride?" She turned her head. "Properly. Not just mule riding. A saddle horse. Full gallop, reins in hand. I never thought I'd have the chance." "You do now." She looked back toward the ranch. "You always this generous with strangers?" "You're not a stranger." Her throat tightened, but she kept her voice steady. "You hardly know me." He pulled a blade of grass and twisted it between his fingers. "I know the way you listen, the way you don't speak unless you've got something worth saying. I know you work harder than anyone expects, and you don't ask for anything you haven't earned." Brielle looked down at her hands, dirt beneath the nails, knuckles scraped raw. "And you think that makes me worth teaching to ride?" "I think that makes you worth everything I've got to give." The wind moved through the grass, soft and constant. "I didn't think I'd find anything like this," she said after a while. "Not after everything." He looked over, eyes steady. "You didn't have to. It found you." She let out a breath she didn't know she'd been holding. "Xander. I don't know what comes next." "I don't either," he said. "But I'd like it to be us." She turned toward him, the morning light catching the curve of her cheek. He didn't reach for her, just sat close enough that the warmth between them bridged the space. "I've never been wanted for who I am," she said, voice low. "You are now." She searched his face for any sign of false comfort, but there was none, just truth plain and clear. She nodded once, slow. "Then I'll stay." His smile came quiet, but it reached his eyes. "We'll make a life," he said. "No rush to it. Just steady." And for the first time in years, Brielle felt something she hadn't dared name. Peace, unexpected and real, growing like wildflowers after frost. The first lambing season came early that year, catching most of the town by surprise. Nights stayed bitter longer than expected, and the wind scraped through the valley with a sharpness that left cheeks raw and hands cracked. Brielle rose before the light most mornings now, her palms calloused from work, her body adjusted to the rhythm of ranch life. She'd been staying at the Jameson place for nearly 5 weeks when the first ewe went into labor. Xander found her in the barn at daybreak, kneeling in the straw with her sleeves soaked to the elbows, murmuring steady as she guided the lamb free. He said nothing, just crouched beside her in the cold and held the lantern low. That night, after the last of the animals had settled and the barn stood quiet again, they sat alone on the back steps of the house. The sky above them was pale with stars, and the moon rose behind the distant hills like a silver coin. "You didn't flinch when the blood came," Xander said. "There wasn't time to think about it." He rubbed his hands together, breath rising in clouds. "You ever think about having a place like this of your own?" She glanced over. "I never thought I'd have a place at all. I think about building a cabin on that ridge yonder," he said. "One with a porch that faces west." "What for?" "Evenings like this. A place to sit and not hurry." She leaned back against the step. You always talk about what you'd build. You ever start? He smiled slightly. I've got the land. Just never had a reason to put down more than fence posts. She turned to him, face still and unreadable in the dark. And now, his eyes met hers. Now I do. She didn't answer, but she didn't look away either. The next week, she helped Miriam render lard from the butchered hog, and her arms ached from stirring the kettle. Afterward, they sat outside the smokehouse, eating bread with salt and boiled eggs. Miriam watched her with narrowed eyes, then said, You plan on staying through the summer? If I'm wanted, you're needed. That's not the same. Miriam set down her cup. You think you're the only one who's had to earn her place? Brielle looked at her, surprised. I married into this land with calloused hands and no name worth repeating. But I stayed. I worked. That's how you build something that lasts. Brielle nodded once, slow and thoughtful. Later that afternoon, Xander returned from town with a box of nails and a length of canvas. He found her sitting in the shade, mending a saddle blanket. There's a dance next week, he said. I heard. You going? She kept stitching. I don't have a dress fit for it. I wasn't asking about the dress. She looked up. You want to go with me? I do. I won't know the steps. He shrugged. Then we'll learn them together. She paused, needle halfway through the cloth. You ever danced before? Not once. She finally smiled. A small thing, more breath than lips. Then I suppose we'll both be fools. I don't mind that, he said, so long as it's with you. They rode into town the night of the dance in a wagon borrowed from a neighbor. Brielle wore a skirt Miriam had let out for her, the hem brushed with lilac from the yard. Her hair was pinned up, not with precision, but with care, and her hands trembled just slightly as they walked into the barn lit with lanterns and laughter. No one stared. No one whispered. Small miracles, both. Xander held out a hand, uncertain but steady. She took it. They moved awkwardly at first, too many toes. Not enough rhythm, but they laughed, quietly, and kept at it. By the third song, they'd found a pace that was their own. Midway through the evening, he leaned down close to her ear. You're the only one I see, he said. She didn't speak, just touched her hand to his chest, right where the beat of his heart pressed steady beneath her fingers. And for the first time, she believed it. The last of the frost broke 2 weeks after the dance. Snowmelt ran in silver threads through the gullies, and the cottonwoods along the creek unfurled tight buds into soft green leaves. Calves found their legs in the pasture, and the hills wore spring like a quiet promise. Brielle rose before the sun, not out of habit anymore but out of peace. Her place in the Jameson house had grown around her like a second skin, quiet in the mornings, steady through the work, and full of small, wordless comforts. She no longer looked out the window wondering if she belonged. She woke knowing she did. One afternoon, Xander brought her to the ridge he'd once spoken of. The climb was long and narrow, the path barely more than a deer track winding through brush and scrub. He carried 2 bundles wrapped in canvas and didn't say much, only pointed when the path forked and offered his hand when the incline steepened. At the top, the land opened wide. The slope fell away to the west, and beyond the hills, the sky stretched out in a soft blue haze. A ring of stones had been laid in a rough circle, and beside it, a stack of cedar lumber rested, planed and dry. I started hauling it up last week, he said, setting down the bundles. Didn't want to say anything till I knew the ground would hold. She looked from him to the foundation laid neat and square, the lines already staked. You were serious. I was waiting to be sure you'd want it too. She walked the perimeter, her boots brushing aside brittle grass, then stepped into the center and stood still. The wind tugged at her hair, and the scent of sawdust lingered on the canvas. I want it, she said. He nodded once, then opened the first bundle, a hammer, nails, a hand-drawn plan. The second held a folded quilt and a tin of biscuits wrapped in a clean cloth. They worked until the light shifted golden. She held the board steady while he braced the frame, and when the first wall stood upright, she rested her palm against the beam as though it were already home. That evening, they returned to the house with cedar dust in their hair and the feeling of something beginning beneath their skin. The days that followed passed in rhythm: mornings at the barn or kitchen, afternoons on the ridge. She learned to drive nails without splitting the wood, and he let her set the window frames herself. They didn't speak much while they worked, but the quiet between them had deepened into something warm and familiar, like the hush of a fire-banked hearth. One night, after supper, she sat with Miriam on the porch while Xander checked the pasture fence. The older woman took up her mending and stitched in silence until the thread knotted. "You've made this house steadier," Miriam said without looking up. "I didn't do much," Brielle replied. "You stayed. That's more than most ever learn how to do." Brielle watched the sky darken, stars beginning to press through the velvet blue. "I was always looking for a place that didn't ask me to change what I was. And now, I'm not looking anymore." Miriam nodded once and went back to her stitching. When Xander returned, he carried a small burlap bundle. "Found this at the edge of the pasture," he said. Inside was a wildflower, pale purple, delicate, its petals still damp with dew. "It bloomed early," she said, cradling it in her hand. "So did we," he answered. He looked at her then, long and quiet. "I've got no silver ring, no preacher waiting, but I've got land and a cabin rising straight. I've got hands that know how to build and a heart that don't wander." Brielle's breath caught, not with surprise, but with the sheer certainty of it, of him. "I want to build it with you," he said. "The house, the days that follow, the years that come." She didn't hesitate. "Then let's start with tomorrow." They married beneath the cottonwoods, 2 Sundays later, with the town preacher and a handful of neighbors standing quiet beneath the new leaves. Miriam tied a length of blue ribbon around Brielle's waist, and Xander wore a freshly laundered shirt that still smelled faintly of lye and cedar. There was no music, only wine through the branches and the soft clink of tin cups at the small gathering after. But Xander's hand never left hers, and when the sun dipped low, they climbed to the cabin on the ridge by lantern light. The walls stood firm now, roof shingled with hand-cut boards. Inside, the quilt they'd brought on the first day lay across the bed, and the hearth waited to be lit. That night, they lay beside each other in the hush of their new home, the wind brushing against the shutters. She traced the calluses on his hand, and he tucked a strand of her hair behind her ear with a gentleness she would never again question. Years passed. The cabin walls held steady against wind and snow. Seasons turned, and the ridge bloomed wild with columbine and sweetgrass. The Jameson cattle grew fat. The herds managed between the 3 of them, Xander, Brielle, and Miriam, who never did give up her morning coffee or her place at the porch rail. Brielle planted a garden in back, neat rows of beans and squash, and in spring, she taught the neighbors' girls to read beneath the cottonwoods. Xander built a second shed, and then a small loft for when family might visit. He always came in at dusk, dust on his boots, his eyes soft when they met hers. One summer, their first child arrived, a boy with a thick head of dark hair and a cry that carried strong across the hills. They named him Walter, and when he took his first steps, it was between the same cedar beams Brielle had helped raise. They grew older gently, with hands that never stopped working, and hearts that never stopped choosing each other. And every evening, as the sun sank westward, they sat on the porch of the house they built together, facing the wind, the hills, and the life they had made hand in hand, steady and home.